Hello and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. It's Wednesday the 6th of October and this is Scotland at 7. I'm Andrew Wilson and today I'm hosting the programme from Edinburgh while our studios in Kirkcaldy are being upgraded. First we will have today's coronavirus update, then I will introduce our guest for this evening, and then we will look at the stories behind today's news headlines together. As of 2 p.m. today, since the start of the pandemic, a total of 3,233,899 people in Scotland have been tested through the NHS Scotland labs and UK Government regional testing centres. Of these, 2,653,567 have been confirmed negative, and 580,332 have tested positive. There are 3,055 new cases of COVID-19 confirmed by a test, although not everyone with the virus will display symptoms, and not all those with symptoms will be tested. I'm sorry to say that there are 34 new reported deaths of people who have tested positive. The number of patients in Scotland who have died from complications caused by the coronavirus infection now stands at 8,721. This number only includes those who have died having received a positive test for the virus in the previous 28 days. Of the people who have tested positive, 988 were in hospital last night, 68 of whom were in intensive care. As of 8 a.m. this morning, 4,229,178 people had received their first dose of the COVID-19 vaccination, and 3,852,067 had received their second dose. The latest UK daily figures show that 137,295 patients who tested positive for COVID have sadly died from their illness, and that is an increase of 143 since yesterday. This number refers to deaths in all settings, not just in hospitals. Now, as it's Wednesday, we also have an update from the National Records of Scotland. As at the 3rd of October, 11,134 deaths have been registered in Scotland where the novel coronavirus was mentioned on the death certificate, according to the statistics published by National Records of Scotland today. In the week between the 27th of September and the 3rd of October, 141 deaths were registered that mentioned COVID-19 on the death certificate, and that's 26 fewer deaths than last week. 9 COVID-related deaths occurred at home or in non-institutional settings, 109 deaths were in hospitals, and there were 23 deaths in care homes. Now, we're lucky enough to be joined this evening by a regular contributor and guest, Paul McLennan, who's been the SNP MP for East Lothian since the general election in May. Prior to his election, Paul served on and led East Lothian Council, and before that he worked in financial services. Paul, thank you for joining us this evening on Scotland at 7. How are you doing?
Evening, Andrew. Good. Another busy day in Parliament. Yeah, very good and nice to be on again.
Well, we're very grateful to you for coming from Parliament and joining us this evening. And Paul, as you're on this evening, a quick question. It struck me that it's exactly 5 months to the day since you were elected to our Scottish Parliament. So how's the job going?
I have to say I'm loving the experience. It's been an incredibly quick 5 months. It's the most humbling experience in my life, I have to say, and I think if I ever lose that, I don't think anybody should be an MSP. It's a job that I take very seriously, and it's incredibly humbling to represent the area that I've lived in all my life. Really enjoying it, getting involved in committees, cross-party groups, and taking forward areas of interest in East Lothian, and obviously helping people day to day. So yeah, it's been a great experience.
Glad to hear it, Paul. Thank you. Now then, we should get on with the news from today. The Scottish Government has responded to the Supreme Court judgment on the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child Incorporation Scotland Bill and the European Charter of Local Self-Government Incorporation Scotland Bill. The Supreme Court has ruled that certain parts of both bills are not within the legislative competence of the Scottish Parliament. Deputy First Minister John Swinney said, "While we fully respect the court's judgment, it lays bare the weaknesses of and the limits in the devolution settlement. The ruling means it is out with the power of the Scottish Parliament to pass legislation it considers necessary to fully ensure the rights of Scotland's children are protected." The UNCRC bill was created to deliver a revolution in children's rights, making sure children and young people are involved in decisions that affect their lives. The bill was backed unanimously by the Scottish Parliament and celebrated as a landmark by campaigners across the country. The European Charter of Local Self-Government Bill strengthens local government by incorporating the Charter into Scots law. Starting as a members' bill, it too was passed unanimously by the Scottish Parliament, and it was supported by local government and COSLA. In a parliamentary statement today, the Scottish Government has pledged that the landmark children's rights legislation will go ahead despite the limitations of the devolution settlement. Deputy First Minister John Swinney said the Scottish Government remain committed to incorporating the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child into domestic law to the maximum extent possible. The implementation bill was backed unanimously by the Scottish Parliament in March, but could not be implemented because of a legal challenge brought by the UK government law officers, which was successful. So, Paul, there are a number of angles that I'd like to talk to you about in connection with these two bills. But firstly, in terms of the next steps following on from today and today's judgment from the Supreme Court, what do you expect will happen next regarding both of these bills?
Yeah, I was in the chamber today, Andrew, when that was debated. I think the Deputy First Minister said, obviously, the announcement just came out this morning. They're going to need a broader look around about, the implications of the review and of the decision. I think there's no doubt that the Scottish Government will bring this forward, and I think they're aiming to bring that forward as soon as possible. And I think you mentioned the couple of key points. I think for me, one, it was agreed unanimously in the Parliament by all parties. But I think the real key message, I think, for me, we need to implement this as soon as possible, and I have no doubt the Scottish Government are committed to that. But this was a political choice that the UK Government made. They didn't have to challenge this. And this was backed up. I think it was Curtis Hughes from Edinburgh University Constitutional Unit mentioned this. This was a political choice. Not a legal one, a political choice. They could have let this go through, and I think it does highlight exactly the issues that we have with the devolution settlement. And John Swinney mentioned that today. It isn't suited to Scotland's circumstances. All children's charities and so on have been talking about this for years. The Scottish Government acted in it, one of the first in the world to do this. And we have this position now that we're placed in there, and the contempt from the Tory benches, to be quite honest, when this was being debated, was palpable. And it was politics. It was a political decision by the UK Government to do this. I've no doubt the Scottish Government will bring this forward as soon as possible. And the most important thing is, it's the intentions of the bill, and the bill itself is implemented as soon as possible. So extremely disappointed we've got this. We've got to respect the Supreme Court and its judgment, but this again shows limitations of devolution.
Thanks, Paul. I was going to talk to you, or sorry, I'd like to talk to you about two of the political aspects of this, of where we are now with regard to these two bills. And firstly, thinking of the politics with regard to protecting and supporting young people. Already this week, we've been reporting on a committee report into the sexual abuse of more than 300,000 young people in the Catholic Church in France. And of course, the Scottish Child Abuse Inquiry begins taking evidence from private boarding schools later this week. So does this legal action by Westminster make it look like Westminster and parties registered in England don't care about young people, whereas the Scottish Government does?
I wouldn't go as far and say that they don't care about young people. I think what it does do is that they place the political, I suppose, strategy over that at the moment, and and I think that and I think that's a much broader. I'm not saying that in isolation. I think this is a broader strategy that the Tories are looking at. You see obviously the levelling up funds, where they're going over the top of the Scottish Government. You've seen Douglas Ross come out and said he would quite happily bypass the Scottish Government. We had COSLA in at one of the local government committees, and they weren't happy about it either. Had spoken to UK Government about it and had no response from them in that regard. So I think it's a strategy around about trying to ignore the Scottish Government when they possibly can. You can see that from the UK Government, and you can quite clearly see that from the Scottish Conservatives as well. That's their angle, and it's going to be their angle in the next few months, and no doubt longer than that going ahead. So it is worrying. And I think if you then add that on top of the Internal Market Bill and the things that go on within that, there's a travel of direction from the Conservative Party, both in Scotland and in the UK, about trying to bypass the Scottish Parliament when it can. They are attacking devolution. Make no doubt about that. Make no doubt about it. They've never supported devolution fully. and they're now attacking it quite openly. And we need to be aware of that and make sure that we tackle that position.
Thanks, Paul. And I was also, and following on from what you were just saying, I was also thinking in connection with the likely introduction of a bill promoting a second independence referendum, which is committed in the programme for government. Does the success of the Westminster law officers in their court action in respect of these two bills today, do you think that will either encourage them to in any legal challenge against a subsequent Indy Ref 2 bill, or on the other hand, do you think it helpfully highlights the traps which the Scottish Government is going to have to avoid in drafting the legislation for that second independence referendum?
I think there would be some linkages. There was also a debate yesterday talking about a consent for environment bill, which is, again, the Scottish Government challenged. So you can see it both in terms of the UNCRC and environment bill. I actually sit in the Standards Committee, and one of the things that we discussing obviously is the independence bill when it comes forward, and I suppose it's competency. So that'll be an interesting discussion. I know Scottish Government are keen to bring that bill forward, but I think it's something that the Scottish Government is going to have to be very careful with and push that through. In that regard, then we have to be aware of the UK Government will try and stop that as best as it possibly can. So yes, I think it's something we've got to be very aware of. But this is about democracy. We can talk about legal challenges. This is about democracy. Scotland voted a pro-Indian majority in the last election just a few months ago, and both the SNP and Greens stood on a manifesto in regards to holding a second independence referendum. So this is about democracy. The UK Government will try and muddy the waters and talk about competency, but this is about democracy. And, we have to continue to press that home. And you've seen the ridiculous position yesterday by Alistair Jack talking about 60% support and so on for to get an independence referendum. And it's 25 years of generation, and it's pure hypocrisy. And I think that shows their fear that they think they will lose another independence referendum.
Absolutely, Paul. And I was thinking again in terms of the politics of this. I had a very quick look at the judgment from the court this morning, and it talks in part, and it explains that one of the explanations for the drafting in the two bills is that the drafting was based on an operative section in the Human Rights Act from 1998. Now, of course, we've been listening this week to the Tory party conference and Dominic Raab insisting that he's going to tear up the Human Rights Act. So I'm wondering whether, in part at least, and you were saying that the calling in of this legislation to the Supreme Court was a politically motivated act. I'm wondering whether it runs even more deeply than that with the Tories, insofar as if there were traces of their hated Human Rights Act in this legislation, that would trigger them, and it made it even more likely that they would go for it.
Yeah, Andrew, I'd agree. I mean, I actually listened to Dominic Raab on the radio this morning, and he was interviewed and asked about that very point, about the Human Rights Act and so on, and trying to defend their proposed reforms, and couldn't, and I think it is part of a much broader dislike, of human rights issues that the UK government have, and that should worry us all. That should really worry us all in that regard. So I think it is part of a broader attack, if you like, on human rights. And this is part of the discussion. This is part of the debate and discussion. I think they just add this on, obviously, and against their rejection of democracy in Scotland, and their attack and devolution in Scotland. So I think the two issues are very much linked. But that should worry us. That should really worry us. If they're attacking human rights legislation, and taking, I suppose they're an outlier out, compared with other countries. They're moving away. Other countries are looking to enhance, including the Scottish Government. It's worrying. It's incredibly worrying.
Absolutely right, Paul. Speaking as a human, I've always been very much in favour of human rights, but we'll put that aside for a moment. We'll look at our next story now, which is that the Social Justice Secretary, Shona Robison, has expressed dismay at the withdrawal of the £20 a week universal credit uplift today. Ms Robison said, "This is a sad and disappointing day. It is a cruel irony the £20 a week uplift to universal credit is being withdrawn in a week in which we are being asked to challenge poverty." The move has already been condemned by the First Ministers and Children's Commissioners of Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, countless charities and campaigners, the United Nations Poverty Envoy, and even former Secretary of State for Work and Pensions. People are bracing themselves against soaring food and fuel costs, the end of the furlough scheme, and imminent increases in national insurance contributions. Millions of people and their communities will be negatively impacted by the withdrawal of these lifeline payments. The Scottish Government has set out a range of ambitious actions to tackle child poverty, but this undermines so much of what we want to achieve. So, Paul, firstly, we touched on this when we spoke a couple of weeks ago. Uh, while I appreciate that this is technically a reserved matter, so it should fall on Kenny McCaskill's desk in your case, as the local MP. But what are you seeing in your mailbox or your mailbag or your inbox, or what's being said to you at surgeries from your constituents?
Yeah, I mean, we've had people in tears. We have had people saying they don't know what they're how they're going to live from day to day. I've been speaking obviously to the local food banks and anti-poverty charities in the area as well, and they're really scared about what the impact of this is going to be as we approach winter. As you said, it's the universal credit cuts. There are 8,000 families in the East Lothian constituency that will be affected by this. 6,000 that are single parent families that are going to be affected by this. It's only going to make a major impact. We now have a couple of areas in Prestonpans and Trent, for example, in my constituency, which are in the top 10% of deprivation. And there are 5,000 kids in poverty in East Lothian. So it's really going to impact. And as you said, Andrew, in regards to with the increasing fuel costs and it's fuel poverty, there's 15,000 families in my constituency in regards to fuel poverty. That will increase. And as you said, in the furlough and so on, it's really going to impact, and it's a terrifying thought. And we can do nothing about it. We can protest, we can do whatever we want. And again, it comes back to the evolution. What powers do we have to stop it? And the Scottish Government now spends £2.5 billion a year, £2.5 billion a year on mitigating UK welfare policies. And that continues to add. And they actually had the cheek a few weeks ago, the Tories, to bring forward a debate asking the Scottish Government to double the proposed Scottish Child payment as quickly as possible, while sitting on their hands and not saying anything about the universal credit cut. It's pure hypocrisy, and it's going to be a tough winter for a lot of people, in Scotland and across the rest of the UK. And it's, I entered politics. The main reason I entered politics was to try and create a fairer, more equal Scotland. This just, goes totally against it, and it defines who we are as a country, and being part of the UK, which I don't want to be, but it's shameful. The act is, there's no other word apart from shameful. It really is.
Absolutely. Now, you were mentioning the amount of money that the Scottish Government currently is having to spend to mitigate the cruel policies that are coming from Westminster. I suppose, in very, very rough terms, the £20 a week the £20 a week uplift to universal credit is about £500 million a year for Scotland, or for recipients in Scotland. Do you think that whilst on the one hand, as you were saying, the Tory government are trying to avoid or ignore or push down the Scottish Parliament and the Scottish Government, do you think that on the other hand, that the likely outcome from these policy decisions is that the Scottish Government is going to have to step in the middle of a winter of discontent and start spending an extra £500 million to mitigate yet another Westminster social security with reduction?
Yeah, I think obviously you've got mitigation factors that go on just now. The Scottish Government will need to spend extra money. It's then what becomes the other thing, important thing I think, is that it takes that amount of money out of the local economy. So already when businesses are struggling, it's taking that money out of the local economy, and so that's going to impact businesses in the area as well. And obviously, I think that there will be a follow-on consequences from that also. If you're taking it out of the Scottish economy and taking out areas where you're poorer than most, then it's really going to impact on local economies as well. So I think that's something we need to keep an eye on in that regard. And we heard obviously that the cost of the cuts is about £6 billion, and Rishi Sunak announced a deal for £500 million, and this is for UK wide, in terms of trying to look at more trainers in the DWP and getting people back into work. And we've heard that from the Scottish Conservatives as well. This is all about trying to encourage people to work. the vast majority of people that are on universal credit work. And it's, we had the ridiculous position today that you had Boris Johnson saying that he wants to fix a broken economy, broken low wage, low productivity economy. Well, they've ruled over that for a number of years. They have no, and they're, they don't know how they're going to deliver what he calls a higher wage, higher productivity economy. So, they're all over the place. They don't know how to deal with this situation. They've created it, and it's really going to impact on the poorest in our communities.
Well, it's a good point you make about Johnson's speech, and we will look at it in more detail in a couple of minutes. But it certainly strikes me also in terms of European politics that we know that high wage, high productivity economies, the examples I can think of in Europe tend to be either the Nordic countries, to which Scotland looks for examples, or perhaps Germany. And of course, Germany, we think, is looking like its politics are going to move towards the centre left. And we'll talk about that also in a little while. So, where do you think Johnson is going to look for his inspiration for this land of milk and honey, high wage, high productivity economy that he was telling us about this afternoon?
I think when you start to see, we talked before around about obviously human rights, attack on human rights, and it's well known that the Tories' position on fair work and so on. The Green Ports debate and discussion around about that and against the Free Ports kind of highlighted that they don't care around about fair work or environmental protections. I think you probably, if you can, you'll probably look towards the US and some parts. And if it's going to be a low tax and a race to the bottom, I think that's maybe where it goes. I think the overriding conclusion for me at this regard is he doesn't know. I think they've seen the mess that Brexit's created, and are trying to get a narrative out there without any background and trying to say, look, this is it's going to take ages to fix our economy, but it'll be worth it in the long run. This is going to take what he's talking about will take 5-10 years at the earliest, if that ever happens. It's I don't think he's got a clue. There was no detail in his speech. It's the usual Boris Johnson sound bites. And I was listening again on the radio tonight, coming down the road, you had from the CBI, for example, just talking about saying there's no detail to this. They need to know the detail. So business will see through this, and I think this is going to unravel once he's asked about detail, which I don't think he has at this stage in any way, shape, or form.
No, absolutely. And also, Paul, you were talking about the fact that, as you and I know, the £20 a week uplift to universal credit goes directly into local economies. It doesn't go into offshore bank accounts. People spend all of it every week. And that prompted me to think, or also to notice that, firstly to recognise that when the Prime Minister was asked what he would spend £20 a week on yesterday, he didn't have an answer for the question at all. Clearly doesn't know the value of apparently doesn't know the value of anything. And then this morning, Sir Peter Bottomley, who's the MP for West Worthing in Sussex, said that it was desperately difficult for many of his colleagues to survive on their salary of £82,000 a year, plus the considerable expenses that they receive. In fact, he says that MPs should be paid the same as the average GP, which is about £100,000 a year. So taking both the apparent lack of understanding about what happens to this £20 uplift in terms of its use by people who are depending upon it, and at the same time the apparent inability of Conservative very long-standing Conservative MPs to live within their means, just how dangerously out of touch do you think Tory MPs have become?
Massively, I think the Tory MPs. I think there's a difference between obviously the existing Tory MPs who are maybe in a position of power, because I think what you'd seen previously was the 6 cabinet members who had been responsible for universal credit came out and spoke against it. So if they're saying one thing in power and one thing when they're backbenchers. The other thing that kind of struck me yesterday was when Alistair Jack was interviewed and was asked around about, I think it was on STV, was asked around about had he spoken to anybody a constituent who was suffering a £20 a week cut, and he said no. And I think the interviewer pressed then and kind of said to him, well, how do you know what the impact is going to be? I don't think they care. It's not their voting base. It's not going to impact on where they see the political benefits of this coming from them. And we've seen that in debate in the Scottish Parliament when they were talking about the £20, doubling the Scottish child payment. They lined up to talk about that. Not once did we hear anybody come out and speak against the universal credit cut. We had a few times that they would talk to their colleagues about it, but nobody came out in the Tory benches and said they were against it. Nobody came out and defended the line, saying, it's all about encouraging people to work. It's an absolute nonsense. This is an ideological decision that was made, and an attack on the poorest in our communities. And we can't let them get away with this. The cut's gone through. We will see the implications of this coming through in the next few months. Again, it's shameless. It's not their political priority. I think people will see through this in the next number of months when it's starting to hit our poorest in the communities.
Absolutely. Thanks, Paul. And actually, we'll move on now to have a further look at the speech given by Boris Johnson this afternoon. In his speech to the Conservative conference, Boris Johnson outlined his vision for an upbeat, optimistic UK buoyed by higher wages and improved opportunity for all, which he contrasted with a Labour Party he labelled tired and divided. However, his speech has had a frosty reception from business and union leaders, with one think tank condemning the Prime Minister's speech to the Conservative conference as economically illiterate. The Adam Smith Institute's head of research, Matthew Lesh, also called Johnson's address bombastic but vacuous, while the travel industry union chief Manuel Cortes said it was nothing but hot air. Business leaders hit back at suggestions from the Prime Minister and his cabinet that they had been unprepared for Brexit and sought uncontrolled immigration, with the next boss, Simon Wolfson, who is a prominent Brexiteer, warning there was real panic and despondency in the hospitality and care home sectors because of staff shortages. The TUC took aim at the government's cut to universal credit, with the £20 a week uplift ending today. Its General Secretary Francis O'Grady said, if Boris Johnson was serious about levelling up Britain, he wouldn't be slashing universal credit in the middle of a cost of living crisis. The SNP's Westminster leader Ian Blackford MP responded to the speech, saying that Boris Johnson's shameless attempt to shift the blame onto anyone but himself will do nothing to fix the crisis he has caused, with his disastrous hard Brexit and cruel Tory cuts. Mr Blackford said, for all the waffle and deflection, the Prime Minister cannot escape the fact that millions of families are poorer and worse off as a direct result of his government's damaging policies, adding, the only way to keep Scotland safe from Tory cuts and the long-term damage of Brexit is to become an independent country with the full powers needed to regain our place in Europe and build a strong, fair and green recovery. Mr Blackford went on to say, under Boris Johnson, the UK has the worst levels of poverty and inequality in North West Europe, and the highest levels of in-work poverty this century. Real wages have fallen, and the Tory universal credit cuts and regressive tax hikes will push even more families into poverty. But just like Thatcher, the Prime Minister failed to express 1 ounce of regret. Pulling no punches, Mr Blackford called the Prime Minister the ultimate snake oil salesman, with empty promises of jam tomorrow, calling the reality of Boris Johnson's Brexit deal a disaster, which is costing Scotland billions of pounds, has caused UK exports to collapse, has hit businesses by millions a week, and resulted in rising prices, severe staffing shortages, and empty supermarket shelves. So, Paul, it struck me as a quintessential Johnson speech this afternoon, baffling, freewheeling, stuffed full of overbaked metaphors and swashbuckling banter, and utterly empty of content or meaning. Now, the audience was clearly delighted, although a close-up of Rishi Sunak's face suggested that he and some of the Tory Party's former bankers were feeling sheepish about being led by someone who is so fundamentally unserious and fundamentally unsuited. So, how long do you think that Johnson's comedy act is going to last, either with the public through a winter of discontent, or with other Tory politicians who will have an eye on his job?
I think you're right, Andrew. I think we are coming into, I think, to whatever we want to call it, winter discontent. When you look at the situations regarding fuel, regarding logistics problems, labour shortages. These aren't skill shortages anymore. These are labour shortages that are coming through, along with universal credit cuts you mentioned, national insurance rises. I think we are. He's heading for a political perfect storm. if you like. The one thing you can say about the Tories is they're quite ruthless when they try and get rid of leaders, and I think he's probably facing a critical 6 months, because if you get through to March, April next year, you're possibly a year away from another UK election. And if they're going to move him, they would need to move him, I think, probably springtime next year. So I think there's a real challenge coming up to Boris Johnson. I think the public will also see through that. In terms of his speech, it reminded me of the debate and his contribution to the Leave campaign. It was, we were talking about having ready deals. The US were ready to deal with the UK. There would be trade deals coming through, left, right, and centre. It was sound bites, and the one thing, I suppose, the consistent thing from Boris Johnson, criticism of Boris Johnson, is he's always short in detail, and you can see that whenever he's interviewed. You can see that when he was, for example, when he was Foreign Secretary, he is short on detail. He's good at the sound bites. He's short in detail, and I think once they're starting to look at it, particularly about the economy, about how he's going to implement the sound bites he was talking about, he's really going to start to struggle. And I think he's saved at the moment by a very poor Labour opposition. And I think if there was a stronger Labour Party, you would probably see the Tories pushing to get rid of Boris Johnson quicker and get a more serious politician, if you like, into position. But I think he'll face a challenge in the next 6 months or so. I really do. And I think if we get through a tough winter, he'll face a challenge. The Tories will look at that with a year to go and think, right, okay, we need a leader that's going to be serious. You can't ever describe Boris Johnson as a serious politician.
Absolutely. Thanks, Paul. We'll move on now to the next story relating to the cost of living crisis, and that is that UK wholesale gas prices have hit fresh record highs amid further warnings about the future of UK-based energy-intensive industries and firms that supply households. Excuse me. The wholesale gas price for day-ahead delivery rose above £3 per therm for the first time this morning, hitting 355 pence per therm at one point, even higher than the spike in demand for gas during February 2018's Beast from the East cold snap. Gas prices also hit highs across the continent, where the energy squeeze helped drive down shares, with Europe's regional Stoxx 600 index falling 2% in early trading, and the FTSE 100 was down by 1.8% in London. UK businesses that rely on high energy consumption, such as steel, chemicals and fertiliser plants, have warned that they will not be able to operate as normal during the winter unless the government implements emergency measures. The Energy Intensive Users Group trade body said there could be shutdowns in essential industries without help from the government and the energy regulator Ofgem. So, Paul, domestic customers, retail customers are protected from sudden hikes in gas prices through the energy price cap, which sets maximum prices for those on a standard or default tariff. However, the next revision of the cap, which will affect bills from the start of April, is likely to rise significantly to reflect these greater costs faced by suppliers I've just been talking about. With such steep increases, 37% at one point today, it looks like the capping mechanism isn't going to help anyone, be it consumers or suppliers who are going to the wall. So what should Westminster be doing to address this, given that, unfortunately, energy policy is reserved to Westminster?
No, I think you're right. First of all, Andrew, that it does come back then to the position again. If we're talking about Scotland's influence and about it can run its own affairs, we don't have any any control over energy policies in regard to that, and it's going to be our residents that'll be affected probably more than most. And I think they obviously looked at the price cap. I think they need to look at that again. I think it needs to sit down with business and look at what options are available to in that regard, because as you said, it's going to impact on many businesses. We've already talked about the cost of living increases, the issues around about logistics and so on. The last thing that Scotland and the UK would need would be supplies shutting down. So I think there needs to be a much broader discussion. I don't think Boris Johnson is on top of the issue. I think that's something that needs to be looked at now as we move into the winter time. We're in the middle of October just about. They need to be looking at that and reviewing the price cap and trying to extend that and see the legislation that allows that. And, again, it's reliance on gas, which we have to move away from. There's no doubt about that, because again, we're subject to these price rises that impacts on business and impacts on obviously on residents as well. I suppose the other thing you're looking towards it. This is going to feed through to the inflationary pressures in that regard as well. So if we're talking about cost of living issues as we've got at the moment, prices are going to go up as well. So that's going to add to the national insurance hikes we talked about. It's going to add to the cost, the cost of living, as we talked about, and obviously universal credit cuts. So again, it's going to impact people, and any rises in any benefits or any wages are going to be taken away by the likely rise in inflation also. So.
Thanks, Paul. We'll come back to Holyrood again, and that is to say that in a Scottish Government debate today, the Scottish Parliament welcomed the internationalist vision for Scotland as set out in the programme for government. The Scottish Government's committed to making Scotland a good global citizen by supporting the measures to promote progressive values globally and offer practical help to international partners, notably a 50% increase in the Scottish Government's International Development Fund, and by doubling of the Just Transition Fund, with the ambition to align domestic policy objectives with the approach to international development. Angus Robertson for the Scottish Government regretted the actions of the UK Government, particularly since 2016, which have reduced its standing in the world, giving as examples Brexit, which the overwhelming majority of people in Scotland did not vote for, and the deplorable decision to cut its official development assistance by a third, which will hit the world's poorest communities at a time of greater need. Notes the increasingly interdependent nature of the world and the necessity of cooperation between nations to address global challenges. Mr. Robertson welcomed the Scottish Government's commitment to promote democracy, fairness and human rights across the world, pointing out Scotland's distinctive profile on the world stage, which he said would be enhanced by the opening of 2 additional Scottish Government hubs in Copenhagen and Warsaw. So, Paul, I think that you spoke in the debate in our Parliament this afternoon. What were you saying?
I did, Andrew, and I'm glad that the Parliament brought forward a debate. And the line I used, in the first line in my speech was "Stop the world." Scotland wants to go on. Obviously, famous words from Winnie Ewan, and we're in that position just now. We want to go on. We want to play our part. We're an internationalist party. We're an internationalist country, and Scotland needs to play its part in that. And I suppose the key things I kind of looked at in my speech was looking at the economic impacts, that we could look at, and kind of talked around about a few examples of around about, we talked about there's 8 hubs that the Scottish Government have. They're looking, as you said, in Copenhagen and Warsaw. There's a cost of about 8 million at the moment. We actually had the Conservative Party criticising in their motion the cost of these hubs. Now, they're specifically there to attract foreign investment. They are specifically there to make sure we get as much trade as possible. And the Scottish Government unveiled its export trade policy just last year, looking to increase exports by 20 to 25% over the next 5 to 10 years. So we need these hubs in many parts of Scotland, in many parts of the world, to try and make sure that that we attract business to Scotland, particularly on the back of Brexit, because some of our traders now have lost that market because of the implications of Brexit and not being able to to get their goods to market in the first month or two. They've now found other providers, and we've lost that. And Scotland's food and drink view on this is very, very clear. We need to make sure that we're creating these hubs across the world. So that was one of the key things, Andrew, in regards to that. And I, the key other points kind of made was particularly around about there are examples about countries establishing themselves in the world, in the place in the world. In 1991, Estonia became independent. Its economy has grown 5-fold. And when you looked at the situation in 1993 with the Czech Republic and Slovakia's economy grew by 60% in the first 10 years because it had its own ability to create its own economic policy. So there are examples about countries similar to Scotland creating its own place in the world. And we just have to look at neighbours across the sea in Denmark and Norway, whose GDP is around about 30 to 40% higher than ourselves. So that was part of the debate. And again, there were some people talking around about, the foreign policy, I suppose, of the UK government. And there was points raised I mentioned around about Scotland would commit to the 0.7 GDP share in terms to international aid, and Scotland wouldn't have supported sending arms to Saudi Arabia to bomb Yemeni people across there. So I think, again, it shows you how restrictive Scotland is. And I think one of the key things, in closing the speech, you'll remember the Alan Smith speech to the EU, when he says, look, we're not asking you to solve our domestic disputes or situations. We're just asking you to leave a light on so when we can come back, and that's the key thing. That light's on. We need to make sure that we get back there as soon as possible and grab our place in the world. Look at Ireland. Look what Ireland's doing now. That it's so the UN chair at the moment, and it's the opportunities are there for us, and it's just highlighted again today the lack of ambition from the Tories in Scotland and in the UK, and about Scotland's place in the world.
Absolutely. Thanks, Paul. I was going to talk to you about the Irish diaspora, but however, time is against us, so we'll carry it over and we'll talk about that the next time, I promise. Because our next story now is that Olaf Scholz has come a step closer to succeeding Angela Merkel as German Chancellor after the Greens and the Liberals announced their readiness to enter formal coalition talks with his Social Democratic Party. Scholz, who is also the serving finance minister, welcomed the agreement, triggered by an invitation from the Greens to the Free Democrats for the three parties to start talks on Thursday. It makes the prospect of a centre-left government replacing the centre-right-led one, which has been in power for 16 years, more likely than at any time since the 26 September election. Scholz said that the talks would focus on forming a government which would bring about progress and the necessary modernisation in Germany, and added he was grateful for the very professional and serious manner in which the Greens and the FDP have expedited the formation of a government. The Greens co-leaders, Annalena Baerbock and Robert Habeck, called an impromptu press conference earlier today at which they declared their willingness to enter serious negotiations 10 days after the national election. Christian Lindner of the FDP followed about an hour later with a declaration before journalists that he had accepted the Greens' invitation. He said his party would not be holding parallel talks with the Christian Democrats, whose new leader, Armin Laschet, has not given up his hopes of succeeding Angela Merkel yet. No party won an overall majority on the 26th of September election, but the SPD narrowly beat the outgoing Chancellor's Conservatives for first place. So, Paul, firstly, the Greens and the centre-left party potentially entering into talks now and potentially forming a formal coalition. Do you think this is a blueprint for progressive governments forming through cooperation across northwestern Europe? Do you think there's perhaps room for learning between the Reichstag building in Berlin and perhaps Holyrood, where we now have a formal cooperation agreement between a centre-left party and the Greens?
Yeah, I think it does, and I'm proud to be part of the Scottish Parliament, where we have the cooperation agreement between the Scottish Government and the Greens, and I think it recognises the importance of climate change and environmental policies. I think both parties performed very well in the elections, and I think you're going to see that across Europe. The Green parties will perform very well in elections as more people are becoming aware of exactly what we need to do in the cooperation agreement. I think obviously the Scottish Government picked up almost from New Zealand model, and I think it's great to see this happening in Germany as well. Whether it's a cooperation agreement or a formal coalition, time will tell. But I think it's encouraging to see. I think we'll see other parties, other Green parties in other parts of Europe look towards that, and I think they're quite a close knit group. I think politically and within the EU, but also out with the EU kind of stuff. There's a strong Green movement which I think will continue to grow, and quite rightly, and it's encouraging to see the FDP getting involved in that, because traditionally they've been bedfellows of the CSU, CDU. So again, I think they recognise the travel direction in Germany and what Germany voted for. So yeah, I'm encouraged by that, and I think if we can see more parties, Green parties performing well in elections to come in Europe, hopefully that will speed up our reaction to what's likely to come out of COP26.
Absolutely. Thanks, Paul. And also one other question. If what's called the traffic light coalition between the Social Democratic Party, the Greens and the FDP, the Ampel coalition, I think in German, if that takes power and Scholz becomes Chancellor, that'll be a shift away from 16 years of centre-right politics in Germany. Do you think that we will see much of a change of direction either in German politics or in European politics as a result?
Yeah, I mean, I do think obviously Germany's the dominant power in the EU along with France, and obviously it depends what happens in French elections that are coming up as well. So I think certainly the new German government will push more. I think in terms of obviously climate change and so on. Where it goes with closer integration within the EU, I'm not too sure. That'll be an interesting thing to see. But I think, in terms of how it then deals with Britain, I think there'll probably be a slightly harder line, if you like, in terms of trade negotiations. I think when we spoke the last time, Andrew, we were talking about the EU protocol regarding Northern Ireland. I think you've already seen Olaf Scholz coming out and taking a potentially tougher line than Angela Merkel would have. So, I think it'll have implications on the relations within that. And I think if the UK think they're going to get away and remove that protocol, I think the Germans will come out very strongly as against it, as I think the French will. So I think you will see implications of that coming through. And again, I think, always try and support if it's left centre government, I think they tend to be more social democratic and try and this is what we're just talking about in regards to dealing with the poorest in our societies. I think you'll see a more caring outlook on that, I think. So, yeah, I welcome it. We'll wait and see if that comes through. I think when we talked that week as well, we thought this could take a number of months to get a solution. Hopefully this will be resolved much quicker than we originally had thought.
Thanks, Paul. Our next story is that NATO has withdrawn the accreditation of 8 members of Russia's mission to the alliance who were undeclared Russian intelligence officers, a NATO official said today. Russia's Interfax news agency reported a senior Russian MP saying that Moscow would retaliate. We can also confirm that we have reduced the number of positions which the Russian Federation can accredit to NATO to 10, the NATO official said. NATO's policy towards Russia remains consistent. We have strengthened our deterrence and defence in response to Russia's aggressive actions, while at the same time we remain open for a meaningful dialogue. Interfax cited Leonid Slutsky, head of the Russian lower house of Parliament's International Affairs Committee, as saying that Moscow would not necessarily retaliate in kind. So, Paul, Interfax cited Leonid Slutsky as saying that Moscow would not necessarily relate in kind. Then they also said that Mr. Slutsky said that Moscow could respond with asymmetric retaliatory measures, although he didn't elaborate on what that would be. So does that slightly equivocal response from a senior Russian politician suggest to you that these eight delegates, 8 officials, were actually caught spying?
It doesn't to me, and I think we'll no doubt find out more in the next few days. Exactly what the accusations are, and normally the Russians would come back with similar proposals. But yeah, I think it's indicative. At the moment, I think there are tensions certainly between NATO and Russia, but there are tensions in other parts of the world as well. And obviously the recent agreement between the US, the UK, and Australia in regards to nuclear-propelled submarines, I think, has created some issues in that part of the world. I know, listening this morning, there are issues around about China and its position again regarding Taiwan. So the world's a delicate place at the moment, and from your world leaders, obviously there's proportionate responses to that, and because I think the last thing we need to do is looking towards that. But it's generally when you look at spending on defence spending, it's continuing to rise at a time when we're seeing world poverty grow, and obviously the issues are about trying to get as many people vaccinated through COVID as well. And we need to make sure that that's priority, not around about more tensions and more defence spending. We need to get our priorities right. And again, it comes back to, indirectly, what kind of view and what would Scotland's place in the world and what would its policy be in regards to, international and defence policies. Very much different from the UK, I would imagine.
Absolutely. And actually, I was going to ask you a little about that as well, Paul. The main forum for dialogue between NATO and Russia is the NATO-Russia Council, and that dialogue has stalled. NATO proposed to hold another meeting of the Council over 18 months ago, and that proposal still stands with the ball in Russia's court. So what prospects do you think there are for proper dialogue between NATO and Russia? And attached to that, do you think President Putin really wants proper dialogue? After all, as we come into winter, I think it's fair to say that he's watching very closely the levers that he has associated with Russia supplying gas to Europe throughout the winter.
I think, when you look at right across the situation, whether it's the US, whether it's UK, and Russia, I think that they're all trying to manage at a certain level of tension, if you like. And I think you're right with Putin, obviously, because I think in terms of the gas prices, they can control that, turn it on and off, impacting that whenever they want. So I think and for their own political base, if you like, I think to be seen to be tough either against NATO or against the Russians, I think is something that they all play on. But you obviously mentioned about the council. There's also the G7, which Putin wasn't invited to. You've got the G20 coming up, and it's time that world leaders really took let's look at the key issues that are at the moment, and that is climate change. That is how to deal with the pandemic, and make sure we move out of that as soon as possible. And let's focus on the positives. I mean, look at one of the things that was announced today was a vaccine on malaria. That's countries working together to try and provide that. But let's try and diffuse some of the tensions that are there. It's not helpful. It's not helpful.
Absolutely. Thanks, Paul. And now we'll come back to Scotland because a report from an independent expert working group has concluded that the current structure and demands placed upon the NHS Scotland do not allow a move to a 48-hour working week for junior doctors at the present time. In partnership with stakeholders, Hamza Yousaf said he will review the report's many recommendations about other ways to improve working conditions for junior doctors and other staff. Junior doctors currently work on rotas which are designed to meet an average 48-hour working week. This means that there are weeks of longer hours balanced by weeks of shorter hours. The working group found that a 48-hour maximum working week for junior doctors without such averaging cannot be safely achieved within current service models and staffing establishments in NHS Scotland. Ministers have confirmed that a 48-hour working week remains a long-term policy objective and will scrutinise the challenges that have been identified within the report and work with stakeholders and partners to develop a workable policy that improves working arrangements for all staff within NHS Scotland. So, Paul, Hamza Yousaf said the expert working group report was commissioned prior to the pandemic, which has changed the landscape with NHS Scotland. And while his immediate focus must be on remobilising services and supporting NHS Scotland over the winter, it's important that he takes this work forward so that we can all take into account the lessons learnt during the pandemic. Now, I understand the pressures that NHS Scotland is under at the moment and recognise that as we enter the winter, those pressures are going to increase. And so I read the Cabinet Secretary's statement as admitting that this is unlikely to happen any time soon, certainly not in the lifetime of this Parliament. Do you think there's any prospect that we'll get to a 48-hour working week for junior doctors?
I certainly know it's an intention of the Scottish Government to move towards that. I think in regards to whether it can be achieved in this Parliament, it's going to be challenging. I think one of the key things for me was the BMA's reaction to this, and I think they obviously welcomed the report. And I think Hamza Yousaf, said he would look at some of the recommendations, such as, for example, as shift patterns, not just shift patterns, but examples of there's a one shift almost runs into another. If there's a doctor might get a couple of hours break before they go into another long shift. So he said they would look at that. But I think the BMA welcomed certainly the intention of the Scottish Government and the report. I think they would probably expect where we would be at the moment, but I think they were generally positive around about the report, generally positive about the travel and direction. And I think the additional monies that was announced yesterday, I think kind of showed Scottish Government's intention to try and support the NHS as best as it possibly can. But yeah, junior doctors' hours have been a problem, I think, in Scotland and the UK for a long period of time. But I think, if you're expecting doctors to work the shift hours that they do, it's extremely hard, especially with the pressures they've got at the moment. But I think there is an intention to certainly move towards that as quickly as we possibly can.
Thanks, Paul. Now, you touched there on changing conditions rather than hours for junior doctors. And I think the expert working group identified that facilities for overnight rest areas and sleeping facilities for those who are too tired to drive home, provision of food and drink for shift staff working all night, improved rota design, which you were talking about, to restrict consecutive long shifts, and developing a better culture could all be put into the hands of individual health boards now to try and make some differences. Now, health boards have got other priorities and have got financial pressures as well, we know. So do you think that any of these condition improvements are likely to be implemented, or will the implementation be at best patchy across Scotland?
I think obviously it would be, that's how each NHS board would deal with that. It's obviously up to them, and I think obviously depending on the hospital and how easy it would be to provide the accommodation that you're talking about, I think it should be looked at as soon as possible. And the one key thing I think for me that kind of comes out of it, I'm chairing leading a debate tomorrow on mental health, and one of the issues, right, not just within the NHS but right across this sphere of work, is that the pressures on mental health over the pandemic have increased massively over these last 18, 19 months and so on. So I think, anything that can try and do to support the mental health and physical health of doctors and generally NHS workers, I think would be welcome. So I think, I think the Cabinet Secretary would welcome any quick moves towards that, and just to try and make doctors' lives that little bit easier, and support them in their mental health. And we've all had the challenges over the last 18, 19 months, but I think that's a key thing. If we can support them in that way, support their physical and mental health, we should be looking to implement some of these recommendations as soon as possible. Some which may cost some money, some which may just be around about logistics and organisation. So, certainly from my point of view, we have regular meetings with NHS Lothian. I will be asking that question around about that particular point at our next meeting in the next few weeks.
Thanks, Paul. And that was our final news item this evening. In making these programmes, Broadcasting Scotland relies on the support of viewers and others who value our distinctive approach to news, current affairs and culture. If you would like to support us, and we would really like you to support us, then please consider subscribing or donating to Broadcasting Scotland, and you will find the link to do that on the screen now. There are other ways in which you can also contribute to our work. If you would like to volunteer to work with Broadcasting Scotland, either behind the scenes or in front of the cameras, or in any other way that helps our work and promotes the station, particularly during the COP26 conference, then please visit our website at www.broadcastingscotland.scot and send us a message there. Meantime, we will be here again at 7 o'clock tomorrow evening for the next edition of Scotland at Sunday, Scotland at 7, so please tune in then. I'd like to say thanks to everyone for joining us on Broadcasting Scotland this evening, and of course a very big thank you indeed to Paul, the biggest hibby in Sunny Dunny, for joining us this evening.
Thanks for mentioning that, Andrew.
So that's the way it is. Thanks, Paul. So that's the way it is at very nearly Scotland at 8. I hope that you have a very peaceful evening.